Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Banda, but you guys can call me Jenny. I'm the Public Relations Chair of the Latino Student Organization, and it is a great pleasure to be here today at the 2025 Hispanic Heritage Month Lecture. This event is meant to be a continued conversation at Hope College as we seek to enhance awareness for the Latino Hispanic community. Tonight, we'll hear a keynote lecture from Dr. Danny Mendez, who will be speaking on Dancing with Memory, Nomandia Maldonado, Cultural Activism, and the Making of Dominican Identity in the U.S. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that we stand on and the labor that has shaped it. Together, we acknowledge that we gather as Hope College on the traditional land of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwa, peoples past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoings. We acknowledge this long history of injustice and commitment to educating ourselves and our community as we seek to honor the legacy and culture of the indigenous peoples. We recognize, acknowledge, and affirm the historic and contemporary solidarities and intersections between Black and Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the extraction of brilliance, energy, and life for labor forced upon people of African descent for more than 400 years. As an organization, we are dedicated to advancing solutions that promote equality, dismantle oppressive systems, and uplift the voices and experience of marginalized communities. We understand that acknowledging the labor of enslaved peoples is an essential step in addressing the historic and present-day injustices that continue to shape our society. We carry our ancestors within us, and we are continually called to be better. We commit to dismantling racism in spaces of our work, and we invite you to work beside us to create change. As a student and a part of the Latino Student Organization, we're so grateful to the Culture and Inclusive Excellence Division and the Center for Diversity and Inclusion for their support in sponsoring this program. Again, thank you for coming to this lecture. I hope you all enjoy it, but more importantly, I hope you learn something new that will inspire you. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Michelle Avalos, who will be singing Fallaste Corazón by Amalia Mendoza.
El rey de todo el mundo, y tú que nunca fuiste capaz de perdonar, que cruel y despiadado de todo te reías, hoy imploras cariño aunque sea por piedad. ¿A dónde está tu orgullo? ¿A dónde está el coraje? Porque hoy que estás vencido, mendigas caridad. Ya ves que no es lo mismo amar y que ser amado, y hoy que estás acabado, qué lástima me das. Maldito corazón, me alegro que ahora sufras, que llores y te humilles ante este gran amor. La vida es la ruleta en que apostamos todos, y a ti te había tocado nomás la de ganar. Pero hoy tu buena suerte la espalda te ha volteado. Fallaste, corazón, no vuelvas
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dania Ortiz, and I serve as the Vice President of the Latino Student Organization. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce to you our speaker today for the 2025 Hispanic Heritage Month lecture, Dr. Danny Mendez. Danny Mendez is an associate professor of Spanish in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies at Michigan State University, where he also serves as an affiliate faculty member in the program of Global Studies in Arts and Humanities. He earned his PhD in Caribbean Literatures from the University of Texas at Austin. Mendez's research focuses on Hispanic Caribbean literatures and cultures, Latina studies, critical race theory, gender and sexuality in global context, and migration studies, particularly contemporary narrative representations of Dominican migrations to the United States and Puerto Rico. He is the author of Narratives of Migration and Displacement in Dominican Literature and has published extensively on topics such as diaspora, gender, and performance within Dominican and Caribbean contexts. Mendez's work is recognized for challenging traditional conceptions of Latin American literature and Latinx studies, and he is actively engaged in both academic research and teaching at Michigan State University. Now please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Danny Mendez.
Or good afternoon. How are you guys doing? So I want to begin by expressing my immense gratitude for this invitation and to especially thank the staff of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. I would like to acknowledge Javon Willis, Margot Walters, Nicole Dykstra. I also want to acknowledge Polly Korn, who have been in constant communication and have made this visit a wonderful experience for me. It's my first time at Hope College, and I hope I can come back many, many more times as well. My sincere thanks also go to the person who first suggested my name as a potential speaker for the Hispanic Heritage Lecture, a person I've known since our own college years, many, many years ago, as many of you are here, and that person is Provost Gerald Griffin. Thank you. Our journeys continue. Our journeys continue to lead us into spaces where growth, hope, and education are always at work. Last, but certainly not least, I also want to thank the Hope College Latino Student Organization and their 2025-2026 Executive Board, Jasmine Huerta, Dania Ortiz, Fatima Banales, Said Lamote, Jenny Banda, Emily Alvarado, Andreina Correa, Moses Ortega, and Liz Perez Silva, and also Michelle, who did an amazing interpretation here. She's not part of the e-board yet, but who knows. I realize that organizing an event like this takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, so I'm very grateful to have you all here present, and I look forward to having a wonderful conversation and some questions that will inevitably come after the talk and the lecture itself. I don't know if you noticed when you walked in, but there was a song playing, which was this one. And it's one of the most important songs for Dominicans that we tend to play specifically during Christmas time. During Christmas time, we play this merengue as a way of coming together in community, especially if you're Dominican and you don't live in the Dominican Republic. It's a way of remembering your homeland, remembering and celebrating what's still over there and that you want to have over here. So it's a song celebrating not just the literal return of Juanita. The song itself is Volvió Juanita, Juanita has returned, but the symbolic return of thousands who return from the diaspora, even if only in memory, hoping to reconnect with their people and tradition. The song reminds us that migration is not just about leaving, but also about coming home. about the complicated emotions of absence and presence, loss and renewal that shape not only Dominican identity, but Latinos' identities and Hispanic identities. Today, as we gather here, some of us are far from our places of origin. All of us are searching for some sense of belonging. I want to use Volvió Juanita. Juanita has returned as our point of departure. It is a reminder that every return, every reunion is an opportunity to reflect on the journeys that shape our families and our communities. With that spirit, let's carry the sound of Juanita's return with us as we begin this conversation. I like to think of this less as a lecture and more as a communication and conversation that will evolve, and it will lead us to a Q&A as well. And that's part of what I'm trying to do today. Along this as well, I want to acknowledge another important space that allows me the possibility of conducting this research and bringing it here to Hope College and making it a part of what, for me, is my Hispanic heritage, which is being Dominican American, being Dominican York, and a lot of that work cannot be done if we don't have the access to the stories, the memories, and the materials that will allow us to create an active memory and active heritage. For me, that home has been the City University of New York, where the Dominican Studies Institute preserves the archives and the collections of Normandia Maldonado. And I will speak quite a bit as to why that's so central for us as we continue to celebrate and as we celebrate the Hispanic Heritage Month. I emphasize a lot the heritage part because heritage is something that is always evolving, always alive, and always contradictory. And it has to be contradictory in order for us to challenge it and build forward. And that is something that, by way of the City University's Dominican Studies Archives, I have been able to do. So that's one of those things that I wanted to acknowledge and also be grateful and thankful for. And this is my very ambitious outline of the lecture today. I will be touching upon all of these points in various ways. Sometimes I might be a little scattered, but I will come back to it, I promise. It's part of the task of a professor of literature, trying to bring back the story and bringing it back to history and contextualize. So I'll definitely be very mindful of that. With all that preamble, then, I can start by saying, Buenas tardes again, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for the Center for Diversity and Inclusion for 40 years of creating voices and spaces for people like me. As a first-generation Dominican American, or what we call a Dominican York in a playful manner, my journey is woven from migration, family, and labor. My parents were both born in the Dominican Republic during the Trujillo regime. They migrated to New York City. My mother was an upholsterer. She used to sew upholstery during the time that we oftentimes call the garment industry. And my father was a fabric cutter. They both carried with them not only the scars of authoritarianism as they left the dictatorship, but also traditions, resilience, and dreams for the future. They built a happy home that was in many ways a continuation of a dream they had in the Dominican Republic, which was liberation, finding a place in which they can have a family, in which they could be happy, and in which they can have children that would be able to succeed. These are my brother and my sister. My sister was the middle child. My brother was the eldest. I'm the baby in the middle there, but you can't see my face. But now you can. This is me at 1 year old. I was already in the Dominican Republic by that point. And this is something that we probably bring into the conversation a little later during the Q&A. My story is a reverse migration story. I was actually born in New York, and my parents decided to return to the Dominican Republic when I was born. So my first formative years were actually in the Dominican Republic during the 1980s, which wasn't a very stable political place to grow up at that time. and we'll come back to that in a few seconds as well. And I want to pause a little bit, quite a bit right now, even before bringing it into the center, Normandia Maldonado, because I need to speak about two other characters that are going to be central to this discussion. One I already named, which is Trujillo, the dictator Trujillo. The other one will be Balaguer. These are two names that you're going to constantly hear me say, and thus I will provide a bit of a historical context. Some of us perhaps don't love history as much as I do, but I will try to be as succinct as possible. Thinking about Trujillo and the reason why we have millions of Dominicans leaving Dominican Republic, amongst them my parents, Normandia Maldonado, we have to think about the time period of 1930 to 1961 when Rafael Leonidas Trujillo was in power in the Dominican Republic, where he was first elected as president, and then it became a dictatorship that lasted over 30 years of repression, 30 years of myth-making, in which he renamed the capital, Santo Domingo, into Ciudad Trujillo, meaning Trujillo City during his years. Not only was he very active in recreating a mythology around him, but he also made use of immigration as a tool. For 30 years, you were not allowed to leave Dominican Republic unless you were an elite or you were somebody that was in favor of Trujillo himself. So for 30 years, we didn't quite understand what was happening in an island so close to the United States and so close to many other countries. Part of the success of Trujillo was also that he was able to create an international assassination ring actively pursuing people that were dissidents or that did not believe his ideology. So when I think about my parents and the kind of home that they were trying to build for us, I always remember me not being allowed to go out and play with friends in the streets, for example, or my sister not being allowed to go out and play with other people. And it was because they were afraid that we would be kidnapped or taken away. So for them, the trauma of coming from a dictatorship that was repressive and persecutory would come out in the weirdest ways for us. We didn't understand back then what that meant, right? Trujillo's vision of La Raza Dominicana, which we can speak a little bit more, was rooted in an official ideology. Dominican identity was only Catholic, supposedly, white, supposedly, and only Taino, supposedly. And I say supposedly because history and reality contradict the ideology that was put into place during the Trujillo time period. While Haitians, the Haitian community that also shares the space with us, a geographic space, had to suffer the categorization of being primitive and was constantly marginalized, with everything that was Black or Afro-descendant associated exclusively to the Haitian community. Anti-Haitian sentiments became policy during the time of Trujillo. And the Dominican archetype of El Tigre, a cunning, resourceful macho, was born and celebrated during this time. Trujillo himself was the main leader, the main tigre, the main Dominican tiger, which is a really weird name, right, to utilize to address male subjectivity. But he made that into an official discourse at the time. However, the most brutal episode of Trujillo's regime is one that we have only learned about in the last 30 to 40 years. And it's the Haitian massacre that occurred in 1937. And it was orchestrated by Trujillo as a way of cleansing the Dominican Republic of any remnant of primitiveness and any remnant of Haitians that would be invading our Dominican spaces. The irony here is that amongst the 12,000 people that were assassinated, mostly in the border in between Dominican Republic and Haiti, a vast majority were Dominicans that were killed. Why would that be the case? Well, the Trujillo regime utilized a very tricky and obviously silly test to find out who was Dominican and who was Haitian by making people living in the border say the word parsley in Spanish, which is perejil, and if you could not roll your R when you said it, then you were assassinated immediately. So what happens when you're Dominican, a peasant, un campesino, living on the border, and all of a sudden your life is at risk, and all of a sudden you have to navigate these waters? Life and death always occurring in this space. Trujillo's assassination in 1961 triggered a series of firsts for the Dominican Republic: mass migration abroad, the stirrings of democratic consciousness, and new transnational processes linking the island to the United States, both culturally and politically. The legacy of Trujillo, exclusion, violence, forced myth-making, deeply marked the next generation, including my parents, whose migration story was shaped by these stories, and whose labor became part of the Dominican diaspora's tapestry in New York City. They met in New York in the wave of Dominican migration that followed political and economic upheaval. At almost the same time, Normandia Maldonado, the protagonist of our story today, another Dominican in search of possibility, was building her own legacy in New York through arts, activism, and cultural preservation. My reflections today emerge from the intersection of their stories and mine, a tapestry of personal and collective memory. These are images of part of the work that Normandia Maldonado was able to create in New York City almost as soon as she arrived to New York in 1962. She was not only a dancer of merengue, she was not only training merengue dance, but she was also very proud of her Afro-Dominican heritage, which she also brought into the spaces that she inhabited. But this did not come with some contradiction at play as well. So when I think about what does it mean to be Dominican in the United States, if we think about Normandia, if we think about my parents, if I think about myself, I have to immediately think about how to frame it in a way that makes sense to us today. In Lorgia Garcia Peñas's definition of Dominicanidad in contradiction is essential here. According to Lorgia Garcia Peña, she asks us to see Dominicanness or Dominicanidad not as a uniform identity, but as a category that emerges from the historical events that place the Dominican Republic in a geographic and symbolic border between the United States and Haiti since its birth in 1844. Dominicanidad or Dominicanness is and should include all the contradictions at play, meaning a Dominican York like myself is also a part of this evolving notion of identity. Afro-Dominicanx will also be a part of this space of constant creation of our identities. And thus, to read our histories in contradiction is to challenge the hegemonic truths imposed on us into open space for complexity, discomfort, and transformation, especially for Black and brown women, for immigrants, for those who live in between. This lens of contradiction are key as we examine the life and work of Normandia Maldonado. And now as I speak more specifically as to what are those contributions that Normandia Maldonado has done that are important for us to celebrate, I want all of y'all to think, while I try to enumerate these, I want y'all to think about which aspects surprise you and how they resonate with broader stories that you have that are personal to you in terms of community building, other activists that you know, or if you're activists yourself, think about if there's anything that surprises you about Normandia Maldonado's way of creating spaces in a time in which it was almost impossible to create these spaces. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit more specifically about who was Normandia Maldonado. Normandia Maldonado was born in Santiago de los Caballeros, in the same hometown as my mother. So everything keeps coming back to my mother in Normandia. She was born in 1929, a year before the dictatorship started in Dominican Republic. She came of age during the regime in a society that suppressed female political participation but nurtured resilience on the fringes. She was trained as a dancer in Dominican Republic, a dancer of música tradicional, traditional music, which would be merengue, and merengue itself has very problematic origins as well, because it was one of the tools used by Trujillo as well to profess his ideology. But at the time that Normandia was learning how to dance and being trained, she was doing it as a way of finding spaces of liberation in an otherwise repressive society. Under Trujillo, Dominican society was characterized by intense surveillance, as I mentioned, and repression, especially against women's political involvement. For women like Maldonado, navigating between compliance and resistance was a daily reality. However, her entry into the United States was not as a political exile, as one would imagine, but instead, she came into the United States to act in a film. She was also an actress. The excuse that was used for her entry to New York, approximately in 1962, was that she was going to come in to act in a Cuban-produced movie called Busquen a ese hombre, Find This Man, and that was her way of coming and arriving to New York. I have not been able to find any tangible evidence that that film was ever filmed, which has led me to believe, and which has led me as a scholar to believe, that this was her way of exiting Dominican Republic in a way that would not cause so much harm to herself or to her family. So she arrives to New York, and as soon as she arrives, everything changes. She begins her community and her activist work almost immediately. So, in 1962, she creates the Mambo Girls. In 1962, the Mambo Girls were created, and it was a dance group with her sisters. So we have Normandia to the left and her two younger sisters to her right. And they performed merengue, they performed contemporary dance in different nightclubs in New York. But eventually, and slowly, Normandia began to realize that this platform had to be bigger. She wanted to bring her roots and her traditions in a more traditional way than the dancing that she was doing with the Mambo Girls. So in 1966, she creates the Ballet Quisqueya, which came originally from the Mambo Girls, which evolved into Ballet Quisqueya. And here I have the question of the day. What does Quisqueya mean to you? Does anyone know what Quisqueya means? Have you heard that word before? Quisqueya is the Taino word, the indigenous word for the region of what we understand today as Dominican Republic. Quisqueya means the mother of all lands. And when it was first utilized by Taínos, it would encompass not just Dominican Republic, but also Haiti. Nowadays, when we say Quisqueya, we're referring only to Santo Domingo and to Dominican Republic. So her usage of that name to create the Ballet Quisqueya was fundamental because it created a very, very visible presence in New York during a time in which this was pretty uncommon. So much so that their participation in one of the first desfiles de Hispanidad, or Hispanic parades celebrated in 1967 in New York, brought them so much popularity that Normandia Maldonado decided to do something even bigger with the Ballet Quisqueya. So in 1967, after performing in the Desfile de Hispanidad, the Ballet Quisqueya became officially the Centro Cultural Ballet Quisqueya, becoming one of the first nonprofit organizations in New York City. Now tell me, how much time did she have to do this? She was always creating new spaces for political activism, for the preservation of culture for her. She was also heavily involved in the civic and cultural club Juan Pablo Duarte, which was fundamental in bringing other patriotic symbols to New York City. And she was always celebrated. She was always a visible presence in these spaces. I also want to highlight that she was not just focused on creating dance organizations, but she was also very active in writing to local politicians. I must say, Normandia Maldonado never learned English directly, but she would write letters that would then be translated by her friends, and then she would send them to different political figures. In this case, she's writing a letter requesting for Hispanic presence in the presidential cabinets of the time. So she would write to presidents in the United States, asking for Hispanic representation as it pertains to immigration issues. So very active, not just in the local sphere, but also having a presence beyond that. This is another letter that I was able to acquire from the archives, in which she is receiving confirmation that she will continue to be a part of the re-election committee for Nixon, who she saw as a favorable presence for her because she was able to create more Latino spaces during that time. So we see with Normandia Maldonado that it was not just the bringing of music and dance into the diaspora, but also a political engagement that we see not directly and only in the Mambo Girls and in the Ballet Quisqueya, but more profoundly in her participation in the Club Cívico Cultural Juan Pablo Duarte. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a few seconds. Because she was one of very few women that were part of that group of Dominican intellectuals that were advocating for a civic club that will bring Juan Pablo Duarte and his statue to New York City. She also created one of the first nonprofit organizations by way of the Centro Ballet Quisqueya, and more importantly, for those of us that go to New York often in the summer and decide to go to Dominican Day Parade, you're also then participating in one of the events that she was able to co-found. She's a co-founder of the Dominican Day Parade. So all of these accomplishments are easy to say quickly, but then when we process the amount of work that it takes and the amount of engagement that you have to have, it makes you ponder, right? It makes you think, how was this woman able to do all this while still trying to navigate her life as an immigrant in a place that is completely new for her, right? So going back to El Club Cívico, it was through her work in the Club Duarte that one of the most enduring landmarks for Dominicans and Latinos in New York was realized. The statue of Juan Pablo Duarte. And let me quickly highlight why this monument holds such deep meaning for not only Dominicans, but for Latinos in New York City and Latinos overall. The statue itself is in the Avenue of the Americas, and it was unveiled in 1978. And Duarte is a profound and very important political figure for Dominicans. He's considered to be one of the founding fathers of the Dominican independence movements. But you need to ask me a little bit later which one of the movements. The Dominican Republic fought 2 times for independence, and we're celebrating, or Normandia celebrates, the second iteration of independence, in which Juan Pablo Duarte was essential. He and his legacy represents democracy, self-determination, and hope, not only for Dominicans, but for Latinos overall that are living in these spaces. And for diasporic and for a broader Latino community, the Duarte Monument testifies to the ongoing struggle for recognition, justice, and preservation of heritage in the US and the Caribbean. Through these spaces, I argue, she unified Latinx youth, teaching that dance unifies, ballet unifica, and that was one of the words that she constantly would say, el ballet unifica, dance unifies. Another act that I believe is the most political, the most profound act is her donation of her personal collection to CUNY's Dominican Studies Institute. The collection that she had in her home for over 40 years contained approximately 7,000 plus photographs, all the letters that she would send requesting funding and help to create all the centros and all of the organizations that she was able to bring forward. She collected everything with the objective of ultimately donating it to a public space that would allow people like me and people like us to learn about how difficult it is sometimes to be a voice in a place that doesn't want to hear your voice. So this was something that she was able to do with some support and at times not with a lot of support. However, I argue that Normandia Maldonado is an eccentric figure within activism. And I ask, what makes Maldonado's Dominican identity eccentric? Not eccentric as in oddness, but in the sense of occupying the margins, challenging, complicating, and even contradicting Dominican narratives of migration, gender, and nation. Maldonado blended the performative and the pedagogical. She performed a Dominicanness as a matriarch, as a folklorist, as an activist, and sometimes as a symbol of Republican motherhood. Her activism was rooted in preserving tradition and in making visible the struggles and aspirations of migrant communities. She was very visible. Her Dominicanness was tied to some problematic attachments. And this is where I bring in the part that I find also important to recognize. The symbols of patriotism that Maldonado championed while in New York were, of course, Juan Pablo Duarte and his legacy, but she also was very attached to Joaquín Balaguer, that other name that I said would be central, Trujillo and then Balaguer. Balaguer would continue Trujillo's legacy under a different disguise. And in many ways, Normandia Maldonado's sense of patriotism was connected to Balaguer. And this we can discuss a little bit more during the Q&A as to why a person that is so divisive would be central for a woman that is so invested in creating a space of Dominicanness, right? Why would you tie yourself to such a problematic figure? So, Maldonado's cultural and political activism in her later years found a new platform. While it did not garner the same publicity or audience as the Centro Ballet Quisqueya or the Dominican Day Parade, she had a television program called Folklore Internacional. Oh, sorry guys, I'm gonna go back. Folklore Internacional, which attracted a substantial following, hosted and produced Maldonado herself. The show served as a forum for sharing events of interest to the Dominican community in New York and aired weekly in the New York City area. It was sponsored by local Dominican businesses, and the program highlighted the ties between different Latino communities. I'm bringing it forward, and I'm bringing this particular clip because in one of those clips, she basically educates the audience that is watching her show and letting them know that if we're celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, ironically enough, right? She's talking about that at the time, that if they're celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month in New York, in public schools at that time, it is because of all the work that people like Normandia Maldonado had to fight for. So one of those impromptu monologues, because a lot of the clips from the show are very impromptu and at times funny and at times unhinged, but she always brings it back by reminding the audiences and the viewers, the work that we did needs to continue. We celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, but it's not something that's guaranteed. And this is something that she said every week in Folklore Internacional. And in that regard, her teachings continue to be central to us, right? I argue that her work, in particular in Folklore Internacional, is reminiscent of cultural and political figures such as Gabriela Mistral, because Gabriela Mistral, as some of you all know, if not all of you, was also an educator of different cultural values. And Maldonado's discourses radiated a maternal affectivity that ultimately perpetuated a somewhat conservative notion of Dominicanidad, one that, as I said before, is shaped or was shaped by the feminist style fostered by Trujillo's cultural policy and continued with Balaguer. Yet, as Garcia Peña and Ana Liberato have noted, public memory is a battleground. Whose stories are remembered and how? Maldonado's personal collection was not just an archive for posterity, but a method of agency, maintaining control over her own story, even as official narratives threaten to reduce or erase her contributions. For all her transformative work, Maldonado was also a figure shaped by ideological contradictions. She openly supported Joaquín Balaguer, as I noted, and Balaguer ruled the Dominican Republic in several periods after Trujillo was assassinated, notably between 1966 to 1978, and once again between 1986 to 1996. He was once Trujillo's minister, and his presidency continued many legacies of exclusion, political control, and paternalism. Remember when I mentioned the Haitian massacre of 1937? The person Trujillo gave the order to was Joaquín Balaguer, and he executed that order. So as we think about history, and as we think about how we reconstruct this history, we have to think about these elements as well. Balaguer returned, and Balaguer was able to redefine himself as the popular democratic leader. Even with all that baggage, he still was able to do it. And Maldonado sought every opportunity that she could seek to get his support. This is one of the letters contained in her collection that she would write to Balaguer. There are a number. She would write to Balaguer, and he would write back. So they had a friendship, they had a correspondence. And he supported a lot of the initiatives that we today see in New York. They donated the statue of Juan Pablo Duarte to New York. So that's a very contradictory and hard thing to swallow, especially if we're celebrating heritage, no? So that's part of the contradiction there at play. Her story thus offers a powerful lesson. The diasporic activism is rarely free from compromise. Our champions often make messy alliances. Even those who resist also accommodate, and vice versa. Let me return briefly to my own roots, those of a Dominican New York, shaped by parents whose migration was prompted not by art or ambition, but by necessity. Like Maldonado, my mother and father arrived in New York seeking different opportunities. As I said before, my mother sewed upholstery. My dad cut fabric at the beginning, then he became a taxi driver with the dream of owning his own bodega, which seems to be something that a lot of us Dominicans want to have in New York, our own bodegas. My dad wanted that. It never became a reality. Together, like millions of other immigrants, they stitched together a new life, shaping the landscape of Latino New York in quiet yet monumental ways. Their labor and Maldonado's leadership are both forms of cultural production. Both are archives of feeling, as Anne Vetkovich would say, storing memory in the body, in music, in daily life. Meanwhile, my family's story taught me that labor, cutting and stitching fabric, raising children, maintaining a language at home, is also a form of activism, an act of community making and survival for them. So that is also part of that contradiction that we have to live with, or that I have to contend with as I think about what heritage and Dominican heritage means for me. Our stories converge in a single Dominicanidad, one that is not monolithic but layered, controversial, and creative. Despite her achievements, Maldonado, like many Dominican women, has often been excluded from official fields of memory. And this is why I am analyzing and writing about her directly in any place that I can, or presenting anywhere that I can. precisely for this particular anecdote. When I proposed a couple of years ago to a Dominican scholar and professor that I admired at the time, and noted that I would be studying Normandía Maldonado, he immediately said to me, Normandía Maldonado, esa no ha hecho nada. Normandía Maldonado, that woman has done nothing. I was momentarily speechless when I heard that, staring at my colleague for a few seconds. Before listing Maldonado's accomplishments, I reminded him that she had donated an invaluable collection to the Dominican Studies Institute, partly to educate people like him who could casually dismiss her legacy while benefiting from it. Yet the more I spoke, the more I realized that this man had carefully curated a symbolic field of illustrious figures he deemed memorable and accomplished, and Maldonado was simply not one of those people. But why? Because she did not conform to the expected narratives, nor to the dominant intellectual or activist strands in New York at the time. Her public stances often diverged from the dominant currents of Dominican migration and gender politics. As Liberato notes, political memory mediates the development of diasporas, and forgetting can reproduce oppression. In thinking about how Maldonado has been received as a favorable figure in both the diaspora and also the Dominican Republic, I immediately think about an event that took place in 1995. In 1995, Maldonado was finally honored in the Dominican Republic, and she was invited to go by Balaguer to give a speech, and she was honored with medals and different events that were there created just for her. And I want to show you guys a little bit of that here. So this is Maldonado about to give her speech.
En nombre de todas las personalidades de la comunidad de Nueva York que han recibido este galardón, vamos a escuchar las palabras de la señora Normandía Maldonado, quien es la presidenta del Desfile y Festival Dominicano de Nueva York. Con ustedes, Normandía Maldonado.
I won't make you hear the whole thing. I do have this part of the speech that I want to emphasize. So in Spanish, she says, good afternoon. I'm here on behalf of Dominican women of the United States. And then she indicates that she's there in the name of the Dominican women in the US, those of us who have gone there to New York to project ourselves. If we think about this wording, if we think about the reasons why people migrate, projecting yourself is usually not one of the first things that you say, especially when you're leaving during a moment of dictatorship and a moment of difficulty. So Maldonado's claim of representing all Dominican women in the US adds complexity to our understanding of lived experiences within the diaspora, particularly during a period when activists and artists were increasingly challenging the state-sponsored narrative of Dominicanidad. Her awareness of her role as representative encourages us to reconsider migration within a Dominican context. Maldonado reimagined migration as a pursuit of recognition in the US rather than a necessity born of hardship, an interpretation that can obscure the true causes and costs of migration under Trujillo and Balaguer when presented to policymakers. In reality, most migrants left out of necessity, driven by the economic, political, and cultural policies of both regimes. The event's staging by the government to its supporters was also very pageantry. You know? Thus, Maldonado's eccentricity lay in her loyalty to Balaguer and his regime's diluted, Trujillo-inspired cultural policies, distinct from the more critical strands of Dominicanidad pursued by more contemporary activists. Her dual objectives of creating visible Dominican cultural spaces and promoting a gendered expression of Dominicanidad must be understood through the lenses of these complex, contested histories. So as we celebrate and consider, well, mostly celebrate, the CDI's 40th anniversary, I ask us all to think about the following things. The first is, recognize the unseen labor, artistic, domestic, political, that women and migrants contribute to our communities. Number two, embrace contradiction. To hold both pride and critique, visibility and silencing, tradition and innovation within our understanding of Latinidad, of being Hispanic, of being Dominican. Also, use art in any form as a tool for inclusion, memory, and activism. We all have our own personal collections. Therefore, we all have our own archives in the making. Start saving those for later generations. Also, cherish intergenerational stories, ensuring that our archives include every eccentric voice possible. If Maldonado's legacy teaches us anything, it is that Dominican youths like myself, like my parents, walk in many worlds at once, always negotiating, always creating. We stand on the labor of those who came before us, seamstresses, fabric cutters, dancers, community organizers, parents, archivists, teachers, secretaries. Let us remember and honor them, knowing that their contradictions, their complexities are not failings, but the engine of a living, evolving Latinidad, Dominicanidad that spans from Hope College to Harlem, from Quisqueya to Michigan and beyond. Thank you. I get to sit. Do I bring this microphone? ¿Me lo llevo entero?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasmine Huerta Espinosa, and I have the honor of being the president of the Latino Student Organization this year. First off, thank you all for showing up today, not just to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, but to hear from the incredible Dr. Danny Mendez. Now we're going to move into the Q&A portion, so if you've got questions, go ahead and scan the QR code on the screen to submit them. If you're more of a pen and paper person, we've got note cards too. Please raise your hands and volunteers will come to you with a pen and note card and we'll get it submitted for you. Also, this lecture was the first time we used live captioning and we want to hear your feedback. Please scan the same QR code to give feedback about today's event and if you would like to see this part of the classroom here at Hope College. Okay. So for the first question that we have, while researching Dominican migration and identity, did you come across anything surprising or unexpected?
Normandia Maldonado was surprising to me. I had not encountered a person that had her political viewpoints while also being so productive in creating spaces that were inclusive in the diaspora. So what I mean by that is Balaguer is a very divisive figure for a lot of Dominicans because a lot of Dominicans were also being forced to leave Dominican Republic because of the policies in place, right? However, it's contradictory that he was also helping Normandia fund different events and organizations to preserve a sense of Dominicanness in the diaspora. So that to me was very, very surprising. Yeah. And to find that at the DSI was even more surprising.
Definitely. And some other questions. If you could go back to your college age self and give yourself advice, what would you say specifically about using your voice and embracing your identity?
Oh, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. I would say do it again and do it louder. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I was in undergrad, I took a lot of Spanish literature courses. I was a double major, but I didn't declare Spanish as my major, as my second major, until I studied abroad. There was a bit of shame in saying that I was going to pursue Spanish as a major because I was a native speaker, and I thought, it's easy. It's an easy major, And then I realized it's not easy. I'm just good at it. I'm good at it, and I want to pursue a little bit more about not just literature from Spain, but I want to expand the horizon. And then when I started to expand my horizon, and I wanted courses more specific to my experiences as Dominican, I wasn't seeing authors that were Dominican in my survey courses. I was reading everything but Dominican authors, and I know that we exist. So as an undergrad, I was trying to navigate and find out a little bit more. I perhaps could have been more active, so I'll probably be a little louder and ask more questions when if I had to go back.
Definitely. I think that's a really good point, and I feel like I can personally relate as well as a Latina who's also majoring in Spanish. So it's a really good point. And would you say there is tension between preserving tradition and adapting to new cultural environments? And how did Maldonado address this?
I'm sorry.
Was there any tension in maybe like preserving tradition and adapting to new cultural environments?
In Maldonado's case, there's definitely tension. And that tension I heard immediately when I was talking to my former professor and colleague about my desire to analyze and investigate a bit more about Normandia Maldonado. Because for him, it was easy to dismiss Maldonado due to her ideology that was so connected to Balaguer. Whereas for me, I wanted to analyze something that was more nuanced and more complicated and more contradictory. Because if we think about the things that we celebrate and the things that we embrace as representing us, they're not always going to be favorable to everybody. So I wanted to analyze that other side, and that was Maldonado for me. So she is that tension.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And did your parents influence how you currently view Dominican history?
My parents? Yes. My parents definitely influenced the way that I think of Dominican history and the way that I live it. My parents were also very conservative. They also had a difficulty in talking about what it felt to live in a place like Dominican Republic in dictatorship, but they would also express comments that were a little problematic or a lot problematic for me from this standpoint as it pertains to race and to an anti-Haitian discourse that they had, and thank God that they don't have that anymore, but yeah.
I think that's a really good point too, is like seeing how parents can have those differing viewpoints, especially between being conservative and not. And can performance also, how can performance also show resistance and not just celebration?
Well, performing o merengue in spaces that don't expect it, in spaces that are predominantly non-Hispanic, can cause a challenge, right? And it goes beyond being a performance, and it recreates a space. And I think that that's exactly what Normandia Maldonado was doing in the 60s, at a time in which there was no ballet folklorico dominicano in New York City. By creating it and bringing it to these spaces, and by bringing it to the Desfile de la Hispanidad, the Hispanic parade in 1967, by mere presence, she was already challenging the spaces there, because we were not seen until those moments.
Definitely. And you mentioned some similarities between Maldonado's immigration experience and your mother's. Did you find any other similarities in their experiences or their ideologies? I think we kind of touched on that a little bit.
They're very similar in terms of ideology, my mom and Maldonado, yeah. Yeah, for some reason, there is this fascination with Balaguer that even my parents had, and that Maldonado also had. And I think it has to do with Balaguer's very public way of funding different projects to make the Dominican community visible, right? So by mere donation of the statue of Juan Pablo Duarte and being placed in New York City, a lot of Dominicans, like my parents and like Maldonado, see that as something that is just too profound to even challenge and to critique. So that's one of those that I constantly see with my mom and in connection to Maldonado.
Definitely. And how do you hope that your research can make a difference beyond academics, such as in communities, cultural spaces, and public conversations?
I wanted to expand these conversations. My idea is that with my research, people can learn a little bit about Normandia Maldonado and then make connections to your own spaces and see who in my community, who in my journey in learning about Latino communities is similar to Normandia Maldonado. Who am I rejecting, or who is my community rejecting that's Latino due to some viewpoint, and how would it enrich what we're trying to do if we find a way to have that dialogue? So I do think that Normandia Maldonado tried to create these moments and these dialogues, and they were productive in some regards. So that's what I would like my research to do, to provoke more conversations and to keep on pushing back on just status quo whenever possible.
Definitely, that's a good point. Do you think, could you expand a little bit more on what you would like those conversations to potentially look like?
Yes, I would like us to be front and center in talking about race and talking about how we, as not just in Dominican Republic, but also overall in Latin America, our understandings of race and the lack of representation in a lot of spaces that we often don't want to talk about. And that is one of those that is central to me and central to the research that I'm conducting. Because I see and I interpret Normandia Maldonado as an Afro-Dominican, but I do it knowing that perhaps maybe she didn't use those terms. She probably used some of the language, but she didn't use those categories.
Definitely. I think we can see a lot of that as students at a PWI, so that's a great point as well. And are there any known impacts to Normandia Maldonado's viability and service in New York City living in the after effects of the Trujillo effect?
I didn't hear the first part.
Are there any known impacts to Normandia Maldonado's viability and service in New York City living in the after effects of the Trujillo's effect?
So the impact of Normandia Maldonado
Yes.
today?
Yes.
So Normandia Maldonado is one of those figures that we know the contributions that she made, but we don't analyze them or talk about them enough. So whenever Maldonado is mentioned, it's usually in connection to her affiliation to Balaguer, and just that. So what I'm trying to do is expand that quite a bit more and helping people realize that she was more than that. She was a creator of community. She was a civically engaged individual that was perhaps not civically engaged with the ideology that is more prevalent today for Dominicans, but one that was so helpful for her in building spaces that are productive for people that are like me. So not throwing everything away, basically, just trying to situate her within a context that's very specific.
Definitely.
Salud.
And how important do you think it is to acknowledge the complexities and challenges that Dominican Americans face?
How important?
Yes, to acknowledge.
I think it's central because I think when we think about Hispanic Heritage Month, right? We tend to think of Latinidad and Hispanic heritage in sometimes very monolithic ways. And by bringing in Dominican stories, we complicate a little bit more of what we mean by Hispanic heritage and Latino heritage. I did mention before, and nobody asked, but I'm going to answer anyway, that Dominican Republic has a rather unique history in terms of how independence occurred, right? So while most Latin American countries were fighting for independence against Spain, right, the beginning of the 19th century, Dominican Republic had already acquired its independence thanks to the Haitian Revolution and thanks to the fact that Haiti became the first Black republic in 1804. And thanks to Haiti, we acquired slowly the independence from Spain, right? Eventually, the second time the independence was fought, it was against Haiti. So those two instances complicate a lot of the dynamics, not just Dominicans and Haitians, but how we understand race within our own notions of Dominicanness. So this is why Lord de Garcia's work is fundamental, as is anchored in contradiction and understanding the contradiction at play when we talk about that Dominican Republic is a predominantly Catholic and white and Taino country, which is all pretty fictitious when we think about that Dominican Republic is mostly racially mixed and Black. That is not just Catholic, we also have Afro-descendant religions that are just as visible and powerful and important. And that is not a Taino and indigenous legacy that is alive in the Dominican Republic, but instead is it's the Black presence that is more alive. Because a lot of our native and indigenous populations died early on those projects of colonization. Unlike other parts of Latin America where indigenous cultures are pretty much alive, Dominican Republic has very little of it alive. So basing an identity on those three facets is basically erasing the reality that is in your face all the time. And that comes from Trujillo.
And would you say that in the U.S., what are some ways that we might be lacking in like cultural awareness with Dominican Americans, or how can we better increase awareness or cultural awareness?
Asking the questions, asking more questions about people that don't look like you, that don't look like us, asking us questions about our experiences, and bringing us into the table so that we have conversations that are impactful and visible. Because I do know that we are talking about the nuances of Dominicanness, the nuances of race and ethnicity in the Dominican Republic, but we're not doing it in venues and spaces like this. Mm-hmm. And this is what should continue to happen, that we have visible conversations that have an impact, I think.
Definitely, I agree. And how would you make a space like Maldonado did today? How would you make a space that like Maldonado did today?
How would I make a space?
Mm-hmm.
Ooh. So what kind of organization or what kind of activity would I create?
I guess so.
Ooh. Well, I would like to think that that's what I do when I'm creating my classes. I teach courses predominantly on the topic of migration and representation. And I wanted to fill the void that I encountered when I was an undergrad by including authors and performers in my syllabus that create a dialogue. So I wanted to do that part that I think Maldonado was trying to do during her time as well. My space is not the dance space. My craft is in the classroom where I'm teaching. So I have to use the classroom as my place for creating that space.
And what are some of the best projects you've maybe worked on or introduced in your classroom?
The best projects or the best authors or?
Just any sort of project or anything you've introduced to your students that you would say, like, this is something really impactful.
So when I was introduced, you guys also mentioned that I'm in global studies. So in global studies and arts and humanities at Michigan State, I get to play a little bit more in creating class assignments that are more community engaged. So one of the activities that I did in one of my global studies classes that was titled Magical Urbanism, I had my students go out into different Latino businesses and interview business owners with the hope that they would find a vast array of Latinos that were not just coming from Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic, but to have a little bit more diversity in finding those different voices of business owners. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked that in Lansing we do have quite a bit of diversity in different business owners there. So that was impactful for them because we were putting into practice what we were reading in textbooks and in essays. So anytime that I can do that, I will do it.
Wow. And is there any specific dance that addressed something Normandia advocated for?
Any specific dance, you said?
Mm-hmm.
So her training was in merengue. It was traditionally on merengue. And she's considered una bailarina folclórica, a folkloric dancer, no? Which, in this particular case, it comes back to merengue as the traditional dance that she taught and the tool that she used to educate about history as well and cultural preservation. So I would say merengue would be the central dance that anchored a lot of her work.
Cool. And would you say that merengue is like pretty popular here, or is it like, do we need to bring more awareness to it as well?
That's a loaded question, because I think that what's happening now is that merengue used to be more popular in the 80s and the 90s, and now we have, and I'm not dissing this at all, I'm just saying reggaeton and urban music has become a lot more prevalent. And although reggaeton and urban music samples a lot of merengue, no? Mm-hmm. Merengue has become almost secondary to a lot of Dominicans. It's even in Dominican Republic. Mm. So when I was growing up, merengue was all we heard in the 90s, early 2000s. So we gotta go back to the roots, y'all.
And is there anything else that you would like to tell us about Normandia? Any other thoughts that could be impactful?
So I want to leave you all just with what I said towards the end, that Normandia Maldonado is a complicated figure, but who isn't? She's a complicated figure that did a lot in a time in which there was very little. She created spaces that were civically engaged, that created cultural dialogues that were not always popular. And sometimes when you're communicating and creating spaces and you want to have dialogues, there will be oftentimes that you will say or you will share things that are not very popular. So I think Normandia has suffered quite a bit because of that. She doesn't emblemise contemporary activist ideologies. However, in action, she was doing, I would argue, similar things than what current activists are doing. She goes out there, she wrote to political leaders. A lot of doors were closed against her. She opened doors for other women activists, and none of that is recognized because we tend to silence her because of her political ideologies. So what I would like us to do is re-engage with Normandia Maldonado, and not just her, re-engage with other political and cultural figures that might seem problematic, and they probably are, but look for other things that they're contributing, because as we see with Normandia, she has contributed quite a bit.
Definitely. Thank you so much. As we wrap up, let's give a huge thank you to Dr. Danny Mendez for sharing his knowledge, insights, and wisdom with us today. Please let's give him a round of applause.